Strive and Thrive is a collection of discussions featuring guests from various fields, focused on guiding entrepreneurs in creating businesses that excel in every aspect: people, planet, and profit. Throughout the series, you can join us, Ramesh and Mike, as we explore relevant topics with our guests which can help businesses thrive.
Ramesh and I met while I was supporting a client transforming their business. When I needed finance director support, and reached out to him and his team. Since then, we've become good friends who share a passion for business and entrepreneurship. If you like today's discussion, then you want to subscribe to our YouTube and Spotify channels. Hi everyone, and welcome to Strive and Thrive. I'd like to welcome on this episode today Callum, who is one of my old friends. So welcome, Callum.
Thanks for having me.
Brilliant to have you here. So Callum and I met while I was leading the development of a drone software business about five years ago now, probably. He joined my team and we spent a couple of years working really hard and learning a lot. We'll definitely touch on this call discussion about what we've learned during that period. But the reason we've invited Callum on this time is because he's got a unique perspective from his current role within the CAA. He is in a position to kind of begin to influence and involve the kind of wider, broader adoption of drones within the UK. And the reason we think this is really interesting is one of the biggest challenge I've faced and continue to see in startups and SMEs is those working in highly regulated environments. So startups who are working in aviation, where Callum will give us his insights, healthcare, defence. They're looking to launch startups, offer something really interesting and disruptive. Honestly, that's a really big challenge, and it requires a really good understanding of the regulatory environment, government policy, trends, technology advancements. It's not just about the idea, there's something broader that needs consideration. And we'll touch on this on today's discussion. So welcome, Callum.
Thank you.
Hi, Callum. Thanks so much for joining us today. Something that I've been intrigued by, from our initial conversations is your journey. I'd love to find out more about that as we start the discussion. You've been a police officer, you've been an entrepreneur, and you're now a regulator at the Civil Aviation Authority. So please tell us about how that journey has unfolded.
Yeah, I think just to start, I recognise the sort of incredibly privileged positions I've had, and the role luck played in a lot of that, I think. So if we start there, after university, I read politics. I wanted to, as everybody does when they graduate, change the world and do better and give back and all of that good stuff. So I thought I'd give it a go at being a police officer. So I joined the Metropolitan Police Service back in sort of 2012, 2013. Really enjoyed the work. Operations. Became a detective and thoroughly enjoyed it. Growing up, always had, as many people do, that passion for aviation. I did a lot of general aviation too, gliding qualifications and such like. And I began to think, what can I do with that kind of area of interest in a business context? So I registered a business interest when I was in the police, and I started a commercial drone company. And we started off offering services in central London, and very quickly sort of realized my sort of USP wasn't going to be in some very specific technical niche, because I didn't have the skill sets to do that, be it in survey or inspection, where the sensors being used were incredibly complex and you had to have a particular university degree to understand the output of that data. So very quickly realized my USP probably had to be around sort of my area of expertise. And that was in achieving authorizations to operate in complex volumes of airspace. So we could do a bit of everything at kind of a reasonable standard in terms of videography, photography, a bit of light survey, a bit of light inspection. But our USP was we could get the authorization to fly in volumes of airspace that were quite difficult to get that authorization to do. So that was our USP. I was incredibly lucky with that business. Grew it to the point where I kind of reached the tipping point of, do I carry on with this full time, or do I continue with it part time, having to turn down customers? And at the time, I was sort of 7-8 years in the police, and I thought, I'm going to make the jump. I don't want any regrets. So as I was about to kind of leave and run that company full time, I was approached by Mike, who was running a team in Thales at the time, a French defence and aerospace multinational. And again, privileged opportunity was presented to me, which I applied for, to run sort of the customer success side of a piece of digital SaaS that was being created to support drone operators. The best decision I've made ever, just in case the wife's watching this, other than asking her to marry me, obviously.
Nice caveat there. Well done.
Yeah. Until I've been burnt by that mistake before, can't you? So second best decision of my life, obviously, to join Thales. And that was really just, I'd summarized my experience in Thales, which was about 3.5 years of just opportunity. The opportunity I had to progress sort of personally, professionally, academically, was something that I had not experienced before. So I really kind of took as much as I could from that opportunity. Became the head of flight operations for their UK civilian activities, for drones, sorry. And we did lots of great work, and that's really where I got more and more involved in some of the more complex types applications of drones, where that technology could really support not just kind of commercial interest, but societal benefits too. So we got involved in the use of drones for sort of NHS trials, and that's really where my eyes got opened up to, this isn't going anywhere. This is going to become business as usual at some point in the future. What's the blockers? And there was never kind of one single blocker. Like ever, right? There's no one kind of smoking gun that if we fix that, suddenly all of our kind of issues go away. But one of the areas I was really interested in, perhaps because of my sort of academic qualification in terms of my university degree, and also as a detective, you become far more involved in the idiosyncrasies of law than you necessarily would be as a kind of a frontline police officer. And I really enjoyed it. And regulation was a challenge, and I don't mean that in sort of the negative critique. Clearly, there's an opportunity there, but because we were operating in an environment which was highly regulated for good reason, and I'm sure we'll get onto that, the pathway that you had to navigate to get the appropriate approvals was complex. So I thought, I'd really like to go at understanding a bit more about that, and perhaps maybe even getting to the point where I can actively contribute. So I applied for a role, and I was incredibly lucky to be accepted into the Civil Aviation Authority, initially in a policy position, where I was informing policy development in this space. A particular piece of policy that I led on was the atypical policy concept, which was the first time that we could safely enable beyond visual line of sight drone activity in non-segregated airspace. My professional curiosity peaked again, and there's a team within the CAA that looks at actually issuing the authorizations to do this activity. They're separate from the policy team. They're the ones that take the risk assessment and the application that an operator might have and assess it against the regulatory requirements and make the determination of whether or not it meets those requirements and that the risk is managed to a tolerable level. So for the past 18 months, that's what I've been doing. I'm the RPAS sector lead for applications. So I'm incredibly fortunate to run a team of incredibly competent and professional inspectors, surveyors, and technical support officers that do exactly that they assess the evidence and applications that are submitted by individuals and companies wanting to use drones and get an approval to use them with a determination of whether or not to kind of grant that approval. So that's what I do now.
Callum, what have you learned going on that journey? Because you've running a drone startup, you and I have been through the challenge of building a SaaS in this space and then going on the other side as the regulator. What have you learned that you could give advice to people on that journey?
I think a lot of people often use this particular analogy in the negative sense of big ship, small rudder. I hear that used a lot in a negative context. my main takeaway from all the experiences cumulatively that I've had up until this point is that's not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes big ship, small rudder, so long as you know how to use that rudder in the most effective way possible, and there's some ways of doing that, it's not necessarily a bad thing. So it's better to be on that ship steering that small rudder than it is on the outside saying, oh, that ship's never going to start turning. So getting involved and trying to actively contribute, not from the sidelines, but in the middle of the kind of it, I think would be my primary takeaway, because that's how you affect change. And my experience is, having done that, I believe I have affected positive change in this area, and that's a result of being on the ship, perhaps to a small degree, having some influence on which way we point that small rudder.
Yeah, really.
And thanks for that, Callum, and kind of pulling it back to that overall journey. On paper, it sounds very zigzaggy, right? But actually hearing you talk about your motivations, there is a logical flow. It kind of makes sense. And one of the things that strikes me about what you've done is that kind of, you've been in a full-time role as a police officer, which I imagine is very demanding. And you are kind of part-time developing a business, which was taking off, which was doing well enough for you to seriously consider, moving into it full-time before the Talis opportunity came up. How did you, firstly, the first question on that is, how did you balance off, creating a business with actually a full-time job? Because I think a lot of entrepreneurs go through that, and there are lots of pressures associated with that, right?
Yeah, I think my wife's response would probably be, there's probably something diagnosable there. I don't like not doing anything. I don't like being sat in front of the TV. I can put a 12-hour shift in over a night. The last thing I want to do with my downtime is kind of go to sleep or watch TV for a couple of hours. I always want to be doing something. I always want to be learning something. And I think that's what it was born out of. It was an opportunity for me to manage boredom when I wasn't working. It was doing something I was interested in. It was doing something I felt actually contributed something to some degree. And once you've got that right, once you've got the motivation, once you have got that frame of reference, suddenly it doesn't become work or difficult anymore. Suddenly it becomes something you want to do and actively want, as opposed to it being a chore. I think that's the trick, or certainly it was for me.
So real energy kind of driving you, and you were quite happy to work. Were you working long hours? I mean, you must have been, right?
Yeah. Certainly at the start, but for me, it was in an area I was interested in because of the challenges that I saw. It wasn't going to be easy to do it, and for me, that presented more opportunity to have a bit more fun, to try and fix the challenges that I saw. I think, on reflection, if what had been presented to me was an opportunity to do something straightforward, I probably wouldn't have taken it, because it wouldn't have scratched that itch of I want to be kind of challenged, either kind of professionally, academically, or personally.
So it's a blend of kind of your innate energy, something that you were passionate about, and finding a kind of challenging problem that was what kind of, I suppose, stimulated you to do this. Amazing. So you created this baby, if you like, right? This business. It must have been hard to kind of make the decision to stop doing that. You'd obviously kind of, your police work had run its course. How did you feel about letting go of your business?
I think the trick for me, and I reflected quite a lot at the time, was it's impossible, right, to remove emotions from decisions, and sometimes emotions aren't necessarily the most logical path forward. I think at the time, I remember really reflecting on that there's probably an answer and a direction that Callum, being led purely by emotion, would take. And that would probably be the path of comfort. And the path of comfort would be, stay where you are, decent job, it's not going anywhere, You're not going to get sacked or made redundant, decent pension. That would be the comfortable position. But actually, it started at the point I decided to begin the business. I realized I was comfortable and I didn't like that. That recognition that everything seems nice and smooth and comfortable now, that felt more like a hindrance to me. And I wanted to put myself back in a position where I was uncomfortable. And that's really what led me to the answer of making that jump. If I stayed doing what I was doing, it was going to be comfortable. If I made the jump, I was going to be uncomfortable again. I would have had to, adapt, overcome, and that would present a whole new suite of challenges, which at the time, and I still do, find quite fun. And probably a weird.
Okay. So that's an interesting answer to me, because I would have thought, and this is my experience, with entrepreneurship and speaking to lots of entrepreneurs, as you grow a business, the challenges increase. They do continue to make you more uncomfortable. Do you ever see a path, had you stayed in the business, where you would have got that kind of continuing challenge? Or was it just very much, this is the challenge I want now?
I think that there's a bit of that. I think also it was an opportunity in my mind to step things up. I was operating at a level, and I recognized myself as an individual could probably only make it so far and contribute so much. I then reflected on, well, if I take me, Callum, in a certain direction, not necessarily the business, but I take Callum in a certain direction, I am going to have exposure and experience of a different part of the industry that I would not have had the opportunity to do so had I stayed running that small business by myself. So it's really a bit of that. It's a bit of, I was getting comfortable, and I don't particularly like being comfortable. And I'd much rather, as I would today, look back and go, that was probably a mistake, but at least I gave it a go, than look back and go, I wonder. Right? It's the classic, right? I don't want to look back and go I wonder. I'd rather look back and go, oh,
okay,
I won't do that again. Of which, thankfully, hasn't happened yet. I've always looked back and gone, good choice.
No, good. And I know Mike is itching to ask the question here, but just one final one. So it sounds to me like there are no regrets from it was a logical step for you to learn more about kind of the drone industry and to develop yourself, and so you're really happy with that decision.
Yeah, absolutely. Lots of professional, personal development has taken place in the past 5 years or so.
Excellent, thanks. Go on, Mike, all yours.
I think what's interesting for me, Callum, is the drone market. I've played in there now, so have you, and I think it was, when you would have started, it would have been emerging, wouldn't it? It was still very low level. There still wasn't decent platforms. There was still ambitions, and the applications of drones, as we know when we were working in it, is kind of phenomenal. It could be used in so many different areas. And I've got a quick question for Romesh first, actually. Romesh, have you ever thought about the applications of drones and where they could be? And are you surprised they're not flying outside your window, or delivering healthcare across hospitals, or defibrillators supporting ambulances? Have you really thought about some of the scope of where drones could be used, and why they're perhaps not?
Yeah, wow, that is a good question. Well, I imagine it's like the whole kind of airline industry. You have to. I mean, how do you regulate space? It's 3D as opposed to roads, right? Where you've got very restricted space and you can control those areas. And I imagine it's because there's so much to think about, because there's so much potential for harm or accidents or chaos, I suppose. But there are so many use cases, aren't there? Air taxis, medical support that comes quicker. Yeah, I mean, gosh, the imagination kind of only. I mean, it's a bit sci-fi to me in a way. I think of Star Wars and some of those some of those pictures in the background of in those cities where they've got just loads of cars flying in the air. So I imagine it's hugely complex to kind of maintain that safety control aspect, and that's what society needs for it to work. But Callum, I'm sure you've got a kind of more in-depth answer than that.
So I think that's a really interesting take. It's also not an uncommon take, and actually I'd kind of spin that slightly, and myself, I consider your take a positive, because one of the big challenges we have when we're looking at integrating and scaling this particular technology, not just in the United Kingdom, but let's focus on that market segment for now, is the societal acceptance, the privacy concerns, the noise concerns. And kind of your answer is not dissimilar to the answer you'll get from a lot of people that aren't in sort of the drone space. And it's quite a comforting answer, because the reality is we've got over 250,000 registered remote pilots in the United Kingdom. That's a significant number of people operating drones, both recreationally and commercially. We already have scaled beyond the trials now use of drones to support National Health Service and the transport of pathologists. Has gone beyond trials now. Drones are used daily across the United Kingdom, across multiple businesses, tens if not hundreds of businesses, for complex survey and inspection of critical national infrastructure, deployed on HS2, deployed and wind farms, anywhere you think kind of critical national infrastructure exists, railways. Drones are being used beyond trials today. They're being used routinely at scale, kind of in anger too. So the comfort I take in your view, again, of which is not a dissimilar one to most people, is actually, even though we've begun to see a really real adoption of this technology deployed across the United Kingdom, the reality is, even though we have 250,000 registered remote pilots, they're clearly not causing that much of a noise nuisance, and clearly not kind of filming through the back of a window or something, because most people's observation is, oh, this would be great when it comes along, and my view is, it's here.
That's interesting. Yeah, when I think of current drone usage, I mean, there's obviously military applications with what's going on in Ukraine at the moment. So you hear a lot about drones and their involvement in the operations there. And from personal experience, I guess I've been on holiday at some kind of beaches or whatever, and seen a drone kind of buzz around, and quite novel at first, and then to your point, it kind of gets a bit annoying, and it's like, okay, stop buzzing around, right? So for me, it's quite interesting to understand that there is actually quite significant drone usage. I suppose one other thing I've noticed drone usage at the moment is actually in film and TV series production. Yep. So the quality of some of the stuff you see now, wildlife programs or even drama series where the scenery, the background plays a role in the story, you get these huge sweeping shots, which can only really be done, I imagine, cost effectively by drones. And that has been, really nice as a consumer of that kind of media. I've really enjoyed that.
It's really been sort of transformative. And for anybody that kind of used to watch the old Top Gear, there's an episode where they're in a rainforest, and actually they pan to, this is a long time ago, I think it's 15 years old perhaps, that they pan to a drone being used to capture some cinematography. And it's massive, it's huge, and everybody's really interested in it. It's so big, it looks like a helicopter. It's massive thing, incredibly noisy, and the crew's around it looking at it. And I think in the episode, I don't know if it's Richard or Clarkson that they have got piloting it, or at least it looks like their hands on the controller. Anyway, an awful long time ago. Whereas you contrast to today for drones being used for cinematography and photography in large media productions, be it for TV, documentary, or film, it's a bit of kit. most people don't turn to look at it anymore. It's so kind of, the utilization of it is so widespread, it's so well understood, and the benefits of it have become so well understood by that industry that it's just, yeah, we're going to put the drone up now to get this shot. And no longer is it everybody kind of gawping around it saying, oh, isn't this? Which I guess for those that are operating it and the remote pilots, maybe they don't like that. Maybe they kind of liked everybody kind of wanting to come see their kind of shiny bit of kit. But I think there's a spin you can take on that narrative that's a positive. It means it has become routine. The ability to operate them in that particular sector now is far more straightforward in terms of the technical, the societal, and the regulatory that have to be in place before you can do it. So I think although there still remains lots of challenges, there are lots of examples where the kind of the formula has been cracked.
And would you say the inspection domain of drones, so imagery, has really sort of been the first mover, and that's sort of much more embedded now because you gave really good use cases? What about, and there's probably areas for growth still there, but what about the kind of, I'm going to call it delivery, but the physical movement? So I know there's certain examples in agriculture of crop spraying, but you and I would talk much more interestingly when we were working on this about other distributions, healthcare being the obvious one you've half mentioned. But then everyone always talks about the wing solution, Amazon's idea of dropping off and products and things like that. Do you still think that's miles away?
No. So though there are routine, so beyond trials, operations taking place at a vast scale of 100 sites plus across the industry already. So Australia, America, certain parts of Europe, in particular Ireland, but there are already distributed services delivering that type of use case today at scale. So clearly there's a couple of things that have to align for that kind of thing. It's not just does the regulatory pathway exist to safely enable that particular activity, but then you get the societal acceptance. So the parts of society that don't want to be part of that particular thing, they're still going to have to interact and see these technologies. What's their view on it? And the customer base, right? So the value proposition, are people prepared? And that is really kind of abstract from my area. My area today is very much focused on how do we enable the regulatory framework. So if an organisation wishes to go do a particular activity, that our kind of side of the house is in order and can safely enable it. But a big part is that commercial pull.
And so if there are startups, SMEs with ideas in this space, and I know it's slightly more of a mature market than it was when we were working here, but
absolutely,
what do you think? How do you think they should approach some of this? How should they work with the regulators? What should they be doing as part of their considerations for their value propositions?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, and this is where I think the most profound change I've had as an individual, it's been in the personal sense. So I think I was always really kind of startup mentality. I kind of the core Callum probably still is. It's what's the problem? Let's fix it. Let's move forward. Just bang, 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 100 miles an hour. But let's just have to be that. They have to be agile. I knew if I was going to have the opportunity to meaningfully contribute in this area, there was probably going to have to be a slightly different version of Callum created that kind of took that more kind of medium long-term view, that sat down for the appropriate period of time to really flesh out and think through what are complex challenges, and not just identify the first solution that comes to mind, but recognize the implications of what particular solutions can have on other things down the road. But you still need that kind of startup mindset for other challenges you might be dealing with in your startup that aren't seeking the regulatory approval. So I think it's been able to kind of have almost, again, I'm probably articulating something diagnosable here, but two different frames of references depending on the particular challenges you're dealing with as a startup. But from a regulatory side, this recognition that the probably is, and we can all do better at trying to mitigate this as far as reasonably practicable. A translation exercise between the way a regulator, any regulator, speaks and interacts and communicates, how law is structured, how acceptable means of compliance to that law is structured and worded, versus how individuals and companies in the real world operate.
Do you think that kind of knowledge and learning is important for the startups that are working in your territory, in your sector? And do you think being able to navigate those conversations with people like yourself and being able to kind of inform their idea, their value proposition, and be able to articulate it and work with your constraints and models in the regulatory space?
Yeah, I think there's an element to that. I think there are some options, right? You can either, as a startup, to someone to be in the middle of that conversation, or you delegate that particular element of a conversation to somebody that does have that regulatory experience and knowledge. So you kind of, we've seen that too. We've seen, founders of startups sort of work with regulators directly. We've seen the decision to bring on specific regulatory expertise into organizations, the use of kind of appropriately qualified consultants. So I think there's lots of ways that you can kind of address that issue. And really, I guess it's dependent on resources, time, availability of those resources, because they're not infinite. There are specific expertise for specific regulatory regimes that are quite rare. So the access to certain consultants might be quite challenging. So I don't think it's a one-stop shop of this is the answer everybody must follow. There's probably quite a few ways you can approach that.
I guess the point you're making there, which is important, is the time it can take and the cost implications of trying to work in quite a complex regulated environment. These environments aren't open to potentially disruption. These environments are open to evolution and adaptation, and that means that you've got to be ready for the relevant skills and costs associated with this.
Yeah, I think kind of nuance is really important here, because there's if we take drones, highly regulated environment, or at least the commercial application of drones is, the recreational use of drones, depending on kind of the size and weight and other operational restrictions, is fairly open. It's not necessarily a difficult area to get into, but
commercial here, really.
Yeah, from a commercial, more complex sort of perspective, I think you've got to break down sort of in terms of market segmentation, that there are things in the drone space that have been done for an awful long time, 10, 15 years, that the pioneers have already trodden that regulatory pathway, of which the recipe for success is fairly well understood, and the route towards the relevant approval is relatively straightforward to achieve. But then you can use the same drone doing something quite different that isn't quite as far down the kind of the regulatory route as other type of activity. So the primary one with drones is operating beyond visual line of sight. So without kind of getting into too much detail, but it does frame the rest of the conversation. One of the main risks we've got to manage is the risk to other air users. So general aviation, commercial aviation, whatever it might be. If you are operating that drone by looking at it, broadly speaking, you can manage the risk to other air users by deconflicting that drone. But when you want to operate beyond your visual line of sight, of which is the pathway to scale quite a few areas in this space, especially inspection, inspection and survey, you really want to not be operating within a confined boundary of visual line of sight. You want to be doing 100, 200 kilometer flights. It is how you then manage the mid-air collision risk when you can't see the aircraft. And there's lots of ways, technical, strategic, that you can do it. But that is an area that's that is the true sort of innovative area of drones at the moment on what technologies, what standards, what regulatory mechanisms need to be applied, that we can collectively say as an industry, the mid-air collision risk is being managed to a tolerable level. So same bit of kit, if you're operating visually for videography, photography, survey, inspection, whatever it might be, pretty easy pathway to kind of regulatory approval. Pretty straightforward and well understood and well trodden. But same drone beyond visual line of sight, slightly different kettle of fish, far more earnings, far more contribution, far more two-way conversations required, far more regulatory, perhaps understanding the underpinnings of how the regulator sort of works and functions, what it's looking for, what it's not looking for. Far more understandings required when you're trying to sort of play in that area.
So Callum, that's, I think you've given a good summary of some really good, clear reasons of why you need regulation in the drone industry. Quite high level, some obvious areas that need to be checked out, considered, looked at, and ultimately signed off. There is this tension, though, which Mike has alluded to, right? You've got startups who are highly entrepreneurial, highly innovative, and in sectors like this, and I guess the number of sectors like this, where you're opening up a new niche, a new market, they're increasing all the time with the evolution of technology right now, right, and the acceleration of technology. But you've got startups who want to create a new space, that want to create brand new services, brand new products, which are going to be scalable, profitable, and which are going to break norms, essentially, to become successful. So there's that side of it. Then you've got the regulation side. We've obviously been talking about drones generally here, but the regulatory side has some very clear and understandable goals to kind of manage what these startups are pushing for, to make sure that it works well in the existing systems as they are in whichever sector, so that safety, greater societal need is met and maintained. So I guess it's a kind of two-part question from me. And Mike, I'd be quite interested in your take on this as well, after Callum's given his views. But what can startups do better to kind of, to thrive in a regulatory environment? What simple steps can an entrepreneur in a highly regulated environment who wants to kind of break a few, glass ceilings, break a few norms, how can they best achieve that? And secondly, how can a regulator, I suppose, work more effectively with startups, again, to make sure that they are fulfilling their obligations, but also enabling economic growth, entrepreneurship, which is generally good for society?
Yeah, look, there's a lot to unpack in those particular questions, but I'll try and give a sort of high-level response to both. I think I can summarize my first response to your initial question of collaborative communication. In my experience, I think it can be easy to think sometimes that the regulator, and this is, I think, perhaps with some people, also how the police are observed, is that there's some sort of nameless, faceless organization, robotic. It's not real people that work there. It's all incredibly kind of administrative and process driven. My experience is it's quite the opposite. It's certainly kind of my experience in the police, but also my experience of where I'm privileged to be now. Of, for the most part, these are made up of people that are passionate about the particular area that they're working within, and they want to enable it. They want to kind of inform progress. They want to be part of the change. If change is what's required, sometimes it's just a better articulation of what the existing requirements are, so that they're better understood in terms of what evidence might be accepted. Therefore, sort of that meaningful, constructive engagement and healthy challenge. That's the other thing too. I get really disappointed when I hear a narrative that certain sectors of certain industries that are regulated are fearful of challenging in a healthy, constructive way those that regulate. The fear of some form of, I'm not quite sure what, but that is just fundamentally untrue. Yeah, some of my favorite days are when I have conversations with those that are trying to do something particularly innovative or challenge us on a particular position that we may currently hold, and that really gets me thinking. Right, that's then my opportunity to go. Well, let me have a proper think about this now. Let's hear your kind of constructive challenge. And there are lots of examples for myself personally where those conversations I've had with some incredible people, some lots of startup founders, have led changes in amendments and additions to policy positions. So that kind of constructive engagement, I think, in my experience, always works best, as opposed to the alternative of which is kind of non-constructive, external. Not that kind of it doesn't kind of have its place of kind of publicly communicating particular kind of viewpoints or positions. That there's a lot of healthiness in that too. But there's,
it's kind of engaging with the process, constructively.
Yeah, and just that recognition that we, at least in my experience, want to be challenged in a healthy way. We recognize we don't have all the answers yet. I was last in industry, was it three years ago? I recognize things have moved on, and although I try my very best to keep up to date with kind of the very latest kind of idiosyncrasies of what's progressing from an industry perspective, I recognize my own limitations as a result of being where I am for 3 years. So hearing and having the opportunity to learn from those people is incredibly kind of beneficial to me. So I think what you'll find is that kind of meaningful, constructive engagement will be not just well received by those who are communicating within regulators, but it's going to be wanted. We want to be challenged constructively because otherwise nothing changes, right? The other thing that kind of builds as a result of that, is in that sort of constructive relationship building. Some of what we're talking about here isn't necessarily what might initially be communicated as this thing needs to change or this thing isn't working for me. It's actually a reframing of, I understand what you're saying, but actually if you think about what's currently written in this way and form this interpretation, does that work for you? Oh, yes. Cool. Nothing needs changing. It's just that conversation that was required. I find that quite often.
You've stole my answer, Callum,
right.
In honesty, which is disappointing. But I was going to say collaboration. And I think your sum up at the end of working with is as important as working against. Because I think entrepreneurs particularly like the idea of disrupting things and changing things. And I think you're kind of taught to do that. And I think there's a lot of, I could do a whole session on lean startup, but there's a lot taught in lean startup that's kind of counterintuitive, and it doesn't fit probably the sectors we're talking about here, because this isn't about build quick, give it to a customer, get it working and go again. That's not what we're really talking about here. We're talking about much more taking a more mature, longer term perspective on what you're really trying to do.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things I've found interesting, I'm actually doing quite a lot in policing at the moment. And I think what you've talked about here is exactly comparable. They have very complex regulatory requirements, and those constrain police officers. And there are companies with some really novel ideas of how to fix it, but it's not going to happen quickly. It takes time, it takes dialogue, it takes working with the regulators and adapting. And I think one of my things, Ramesh, and this is from a finance perspective, is the capital investment in doing a kind of startup in this space is probably more difficult than in a traditional B2C place. And I think people who want to build businesses in healthcare and in drone sectors and aviation sectors and regulated environments need to be prepared to play the longer game. And they need to work out what their business model is, sustainability for a period of time, but also how to understand how to work with the regulators on a continuous improvement approach rather than a technological step change approach.
That's some very good points from both of you there. And Mike, to your point, you're going to have to develop some kind of business model that can absorb the length of time it'll take to work with the regulators constructively, fingers crossed, to kind of enable your service or product to take the steps forwards that you need. And I suppose the challenge maybe from my side to regulators is how do how do you encourage these conversations? How do you develop these forums, and also how do you move quicker? And there are challenges to that. There's a resource shortage at regulation level, just as there is at startup, kind of entrepreneurship level. So yeah, I get the challenges with that. One question that I have, again, for both of you, I'm quite interested in this one. We're talking about here regulation in the drone industry specifically, where I believe it's quite strongly regulated because it's an obvious area for regulation. If you look at more disruptive entrepreneurial models that have happened in the past that have scaled quickly, I'm thinking of, for example, Uber, Airbnb, those models. Uber, if I kind of recall correctly, just broke a lot of norms and just carried on regardless of what regulators said. And then they adopted a much more kind of antagonistic approach, which I think led to a lot of success and growth initially, but which is kind of now caught up with them a little bit. And Airbnb, to some extent, I think is now struggling with greater regulation as the regulators catch up with the paths that organization has the challenges that organization has created. What do you guys, how do you deal with those kind of scenarios as a regulator?
Disrupting an industry that's not already got the regulation is key, right? AI companies are doing it right now. The regulation is not there. So
absolutely.
they're able to move really fast and get position, and the regulation to the environment plays catch up. It's when you're in an industry that's already regulated that you're that the innovation is more challenging, if you see what I mean. I think Uber has been followed very quickly, right? That's what's happened as part of Uber's model.
Yeah. I think my kind of observation on that would be, I don't think that's new, right? We didn't have a regulator for driving standards until the point that cars had been on the road for quite some time, right? The regulations for seatbelts didn't come in until seatbelts were invented. I think it's a natural progression, right? That for the most part, regulation will always be playing catch up to some degree with innovation. I think the trick is not trying to flip that, but how do you regulate something that isn't created yet? It's ensuring that kind of the relationship between regulator and innovator is a strong one, in order that you can minimize just how far behind that regulatory reform is. Not just minimize the delay, but also ensure that whatever regulation comes in is proportionate as possible and is the minimum required to manage that risk, whatever that risk might be, to a tolerable level. So that really close working relationship, I think, is critical, and those that are regulating, understanding. And I think it's important to make the distinction between sort of the legislature and a regulator. For the most part, certainly in the United Kingdom, regulators don't create the law. The law is created by the legislature, by government, by parliament. And then the regulator's job is to enforce that law, and in some instances create acceptable means of compliance against that law. So this isn't just about really close working relationships between regulator and innovator. It's also strong, close working relationships between innovator and government, because they will be the ones that set the initial kind of position of regulator, go and follow and ensure compliance with this law that we've drafted.
That makes sense. And what's your view on the AI scenario, Callum? Mike's raised a really good point there. It is highly unregulated at the moment, and the companies driving AI forwards are pushing hard, fast. How do you think that's going to play out?
No, this is tricky, right? There's so much to this, not only because of the umbrella term of AI and what specific sort of connotation of AI are we talking about when we have this conversation. I think there's for me personally, the conversation and consideration is really around sort of national defence at the moment. I think we can have all the regulation and protections and safeguards we think are appropriate in place for our country for AI. But if an adversary or potential future adversary don't have them, and they innovate in that domain to such a degree that they outstrip our capability to defend ourselves, we've shot ourselves in the foot a little bit, right? I mean, it's completely outside the scope of my professional kind of, albeit what is entirely within the scope of my professional area is introducing higher degrees of autonomy within uncrewed aviation. I've got a master's thesis that I'm writing now that focuses on that. But if we kind of jump outside of where I focus at the moment in my particular kind of sector, AI more broadly, Callum's more concerned with if too much regulation in our area constrains our ability to innovate against what our adversaries might be doing in the future. So in potential future conflict, they may be more progressed than us, and we know sort of AI and the associated technology is going to be a significant contributor to whatever future conflict looks like.
I guess you've got AI playing in the aviation industry as well, haven't you? Because there's things like single pilot airline. I can't remember what it's called now, but
so we can certainly talk about kind of the application of sort of the umbrella term of AI and the associated underpinning technologies within aviation, in civil aviation. I've given you kind of the high level Callum view of AI and regulating AI at the moment.
But it's the same problem where you are, isn't it? The opportunities are there in autonomy in airline industries, but I guess it's the same risk and understanding.
Yeah, there's a lot there, right? And a lot of it surrounds kind of your views and interpretation, both at a legal and a technological level, of kind of the delineation between autonomy, of which will utilize certain technologies that are under that AI umbrella, versus things that are just highly automated and predeterministic. So there's so much nuance and idiosyncrasy to kind of the AI question. It's kind of challenging to give kind of a one-stop shop answer.
I'm of the view AI needs a new lexicon, because there's so many different types that fall under this big umbrella that it's the nuances of deterministic versus stochastic AI and all sorts of things. It affects massively the applications of it.
Yeah, absolutely. The challenge from a regulatory space, if you're talking about aviation or rail, nuclear, whatever it might be, is the software assurance. So at the moment, all of those industries have specific standards in place to ensure the integrity of software that is written for predeterministic systems, so highly automated. The challenge that's emerging, and it's an emerging observation in my master's thesis, is existing software standards, depending on the particular AI technology being applied, doesn't really work. So how do you assure, especially when it's still learning? So if that particular technology is still in learning mode, and look, I'm taking this up kind of very high level here. Try not to get too technical in the weeds, but if that particular autonomous system is still learning, and its code base is still changing, how do you assure it? How do you check it for defects and bugs? How do you ensure that those don't get introduced? So if you're talking about safety critical systems and you need an absolute assurance as to kind of the integrity of that software, how do you achieve that when that software code base can change over time? That's a question, not a statement, and I don't think we've got an answer to it yet.
Really interesting. Right, we're nearly coming to the end. What's next for you, Callum? There's an entrepreneur in you, Callum, and I know you love what you're doing in the regulatory space. But where are you going next?
Maybe, but currently potentially an entrepreneur with a 2-year-old. So that's yeah. No, look, I'm still learning every day. I'm still really enjoying the privileged position I'm in to actively contribute what I think to be meaningfully to this particular sector that I'm incredibly passionate about. And I think my passion now is primarily driven by a honestly held belief that these technologies are going to have a transformative effect in a societal context. That in the future, these technologies, not that they're not already doing so now to some scale, but in a much bigger scale, is going to touch almost everybody in a positive way. And that, for me, my takeaway is I genuinely believe now I have a better opportunity to positively touch more people's lives doing what I'm doing now than I did when I was a police officer. I guess that's my kind of final takeaway.
Really good. I'm going to give Ramesh the light in a minute, and he's just coughing. But what I would say, my insight is, and I'm disappointed I didn't touch on this actually. Well, I think one of the most amazing use cases I've ever worked on was with you, and was with the drone use in land cadastre. The potential game-changing benefits of knowing who owns what land rights in anywhere in the world is phenomenal. It's an exponential benefit. And for me, some of these use cases that come out are inspiring to people. And I think, but what the lesson I've learned, and it's a lesson we've talked about on this, is that if you're going to do these kind of game-changing things, you have to have a long road. You need to look at the long journey. You have to long business case, and you have to work with the regulators and the environment and the policy makers to actually work within the micro changes that occur rather than the macro step changes that people think occur. And I'd say that's kind of my view in any of these sectors: healthcare, policing, aviation. Ramesh, what about yourself?
Well, I think the big message from today's discussion for me is just that emphasis for both entrepreneurs and also for regulators, and that's proactive collaboration. I think we've touched on that quite a few times, and it's a key theme. And actually, it is for both sides of that equation to work towards that, because it is for the greater good, and you know that will lead to much better outcomes. And the more you speak, the more you communicate, the more you understand the position, and hopefully increase chances of that better outcome. So thank you, Callum. That's been really enlightening, really interesting. I've loved the information you've given us about the drone industry and the various challenges, the various opportunities there. But all of these points are so relevant to so many areas now. So it's been great, and I really appreciate your time.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much. So thank you everyone for listening to and watching To Strive and Thrive. I hope you enjoyed this discussion with Callum. Again, thank you very much, Callum. So for everyone listening, Strive and Thrive are our regular series of discussions for entrepreneurs and business leaders. We've got a really interesting pipeline of guests over the next 3 to 6 months now, which is really exciting. We'll be sharing more on LinkedIn, YouTube channels of what's coming on and who's on next. If you've enjoyed today's episodes, we'd be super grateful if you would like us, follow us on all the relevant channels. And thanks very much to Ramesh. Thank you very much to the Strive and Thrive team who work in the background, and thanks again to Callum. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for listening to Strive and Thrive.